There is a very specific kind of quiet that only exists deep in the Canadian backcountry. It isn't peaceful at all, but rather heavy, expectant, and deeply unsettling. When you are miles away from the nearest town, the silence starts to feel like a physical weight pressing aggressively against your ears. The vast stretches of pine trees seem to swallow every sound, leaving you feeling entirely alone in the world. Most people drive right through these isolated northern stretches without ever looking back at the shadows. Those who decide to stop usually have a desperate reason, just like a man named Declan did last November. He was exhausted, running low on fuel, and practically begging for any place to rest his eyes. He was running from a life that had completely fallen apart back in the noisy streets of Toronto. All he wanted was an empty room, a locked door, and a place to hide somewhere far up north. He found exactly that in a crumbling boarding house tucked away off a nameless logging road near Algonquin. The weather-beaten sign out front simply read "Rooms" in peeling, blood-red paint that barely clung to the wood. The entire structure looked like it had been rotting into the damp earth for decades. It was the absolute last place anyone would ever look for someone who wanted to disappear. If he had known what was waiting on the other side of that heavy wooden door, he would have kept driving until his gas tank ran completely dry. The freezing rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets when Declan finally cut the engine of his rusted sedan. He grabbed his single duffel bag from the passenger seat and made a frantic dash for the rotting porch of the main house. Inside the dimly lit lobby, the stifling air smelled heavily of damp wool, stale coffee, and old wood smoke. An elderly man with clouded eyes and deeply leathery skin was sitting perfectly still behind a scratched wooden counter. The ancient floorboards whined under Declan's heavy boots, breaking the uncomfortable silence of the room. The proprietor did not ask for a credit card, a driver's license, or even a name. He simply extended an open palm, waiting for whatever cash his desperate new guest could offer. The old man stared right through Declan for a long, deeply uncomfortable moment before reaching under the desk. He slowly slid a remarkably heavy, tarnished brass key across the deeply scarred wooden counter. He stated the price was $40 for the night, payable immediately in untraceable cash. Declan quickly handed over 2 crumpled bills and picked up the freezing metal key with numb fingers. The old man leaned forward slightly, his cloudy eyes suddenly focusing with alarming clarity. He offered a single, bizarre piece of unsolicited advice before returning to his rigid posture. He explicitly told Declan to lock the door, go straight to sleep, and absolutely never look through the keyhole under any circumstances. Declan let out a dry, nervous laugh, assuming the grizzled old guy was just trying to spook an obvious city boy. The innkeeper did not smile back, merely pointing a crooked, trembling finger toward a remarkably dark hallway on the left. The narrow corridor was suffocating, lacking any overhead lights or windows to break the gloom. The ancient floorboards groaned agonizingly loud under Declan's wet boots as he carefully made his way down the passage. The faded floral wallpaper was peeling away in long, sickly yellow strips that looked uncomfortably like shedding dead skin. The smell of copper and damp earth grew noticeably stronger the deeper he walked into the belly of the house. He finally found room number 4 at the very end of the hall, half consumed by the creeping shadows. The rented room was remarkably sparse, containing nothing more than a sagging mattress, a single dim lamp, and a dusty wooden nightstand. Declan tossed his soaked bag onto the bare mattress and let out a long, physically exhausting sigh. He walked over to the small, cracked window, hoping to catch a glimpse of his car parked outside. The filthy glass was far too grimy to see anything except the blurry, swaying silhouettes of dead pine trees. The biting, unnatural chill in the small room immediately urged him to keep his heavy winter coat fully zipped. He turned his attention back to the heavy oak door, suddenly remembering the bizarre warning from the front desk. He reached out and forcefully twisted the deadbolt, feeling a small surge of relief as the lock clicked solidly into place. There was indeed a large, incredibly old-fashioned keyhole positioned directly below the rusted brass doorknob. It seemed unusually wide, almost big enough to slide a thick index finger entirely through the dark opening. A strange, metallic draft seemed to be blowing steadily through the hole, carrying the faintest scent of rust. Declan shook his head at the utter absurdity of his own rising paranoia and quickly turned his back on the door. He unlaced his soaking wet boots, dropped them on the floor, and crawled awkwardly under the scratchy woolen blankets. He stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the heavy rain battering against the fragile roof. Pure exhaustion finally overpowered his lingering anxiety, rapidly pulling him down into a remarkably deep, dreamless sleep. He woke up abruptly several hours later to an absolute, thick, and suffocating darkness filling the tiny room. The single cheap lamp on the nightstand completely refused to turn on when he frantically fumbled for the plastic switch. The comforting sound of the heavy rain had stopped entirely, replaced by a terrifying dead silence. That profound quiet was soon shattered by a faint, wet, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere out in the dark hallway. It sounded exactly like bare, fleshy feet dragging incredibly slowly against the warped wooden floorboards. The sickening, wet slapping sound grew steadily louder as whatever was out there approached his end of the corridor. The noise abruptly stopped right outside his locked door, leaving him completely paralyzed in the bed with a sudden, icy dread. The air inside the room turned freezing, thick with the scent of stagnant water and something metallic, like an old kitchen knife. Declan held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a metal cage. The wet dragging sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was infinitely worse than the noise. He could feel a heavy, malicious presence just on the other side of that thin, rotted wooden door. It felt as if something was waiting for him to make the slightest movement or sound. His skin crawled with an instinctual, primal fear that he had never known before that terrifying moment. Against every shred of rational thought, his body betrayed him by sliding off the mattress and onto the cold, dusty floor. He crawled on his hands and knees toward the door, his movements shaky and completely uncoordinated. His eyes locked onto the dark keyhole, which now seemed to be glowing with a faint, sickly gray light coming from the hallway. He tried to tell himself it was just a draft, or the moonlight playing tricks on his terrified, exhausted mind. He knew he should crawl back to the bed and cover his head with the blankets to hide. Yet, the overwhelming urge to know what was standing just inches away was far stronger than his survival instinct. He pressed his eye against the cold, jagged metal of the keyhole and held his breath until his lungs burned. At first, there was only a blur of shadows that made no sense, like looking through a kaleidoscope of oil and thick ink. Then, his vision sharpened, and he saw a hand resting against the wood of his door. The skin was not skin at all, but something that looked like wet, translucent plastic stretched tight over dark, pulsating meat. It was impossibly long, with fingers that had far too many joints, bending in directions that no human bone should ever allow. The hand was twitching rhythmically, tapping against the wood as if it were trying to figure out how the lock worked. A second later, a large, bloodshot eye pressed against the other side of the door, staring directly into the keyhole. It was not a human eye, for the pupil was a vertical slit that flickered and pulsed like a dying, faulty light bulb. Declan recoiled in absolute terror, scrambling backward until his back hit the cold, peeling wall of the room. He realized with a sickening thud in his chest that the thing on the other side knew exactly who was watching it. The lock began to grind, not as if it were being turned by a key, but as if the door itself were trying to dissolve. The wood groaned under the pressure, splintering and buckling inward with a wet, tearing noise that made his stomach turn. He stood up, his legs shaking violently, and desperately looked for any way to barricade the door against the intruder. There was only a light wooden chair that would never hold against the force pushing from the dark hallway. He understood now why the old man at the front desk hadn't looked him in the eye when he gave his warning. The house wasn't a boarding house at all. It was a feeding trough for whatever lived in these desolate woods. He was just another temporary meal passing through, left to fend for himself against the inevitable. There was no escape through the door, and the heavy window was clearly painted shut decades ago. If you ever find yourself driving through these forgotten, desolate stretches of the Canadian North, pay close attention to the local warnings you might hear. Sometimes the stories people tell in these lonely roadside diners aren't just myths meant to entertain the tired, passing travelers. I've compiled a list of the specific recurring signs that this place is looking for its next guest, and you need to see them before you check into anywhere. Everything you need to know to survive a night like this is waiting for you in the pinned comment below this video. Check it right now, because the things that wait in the dark don't just want a room for the night. Declan grabbed the chair and shoved it under the handle, but he knew it was a completely futile and desperate gesture. The door was already beginning to bow, the dry wood fibers snapping with the sound of breaking twigs. Something wet and hot started to seep through the gap between the door and the frame, pooling on the floor. It was viscous, dark, and smelled like a combination of rotting leaves and fresh, warm iron. He scrambled into the corner of the room, clutching his knees to his chest as he waited for the door to finally give way. The wood let out one final, agonizing crack before the entire panel began to slowly melt inward. The heavy oak door finally shattered inward with a sickening crunch, sending jagged wooden splinters flying across the tiny room. Declan did not wait to see what kind of nightmare was pushing its way through the ruined frame. He scrambled frantically backward on his hands and knees until his shoulders hit the freezing glass of the painted window. A massive, twitching shadow poured into the doorway, moving less like a solid body and more like a mound of decaying wet leaves. The smell of ancient dirt and rusted iron became so intensely overpowering that he immediately gagged. He desperately kicked at the fragile wooden chair, trying to create any sort of pathetic barrier between himself and that thing. The shapeless mass dragged itself across the floorboards, leaving a thick, dark trail of foul-smelling liquid in its wake. Declan spun around and hammered his bare fists against the filthy glass, praying the old pane would shatter. The freezing Canadian wind howled just outside, sounding like a cruel mockery of his desperate situation. He grabbed the heavy base of the cheap bedside lamp and swung it wildly at the center of the window. The glass finally broke with a sharp crash, letting a violent blast of freezing rain and pine needles into the room. He did not care about the jagged shards lining the frame as he shoved his upper body through the narrow opening. Just as his waist cleared the windowsill, something unbelievably cold and wet clamped down hard around his left ankle. It did not feel like a hand, but rather a thick, pulsing root wrapped tightly in a layer of slippery slime. Declan screamed out into the pitch-black woods, kicking his trapped leg with every ounce of terrifying adrenaline left in his body. The grip only tightened, digging painfully into his skin and slowly dragging him backward over the broken glass. Sharp pieces of the window frame sliced deep into his stomach, soaking his shirt in fresh, warm blood. He wildly clawed at the wet, rotting wood of the exterior wall, tearing his fingernails down to the quick. The relentless pulling force felt completely mechanical, lacking any sort of hesitation or human rhythm. In a moment of pure, blind panic, Declan twisted his entire body around and viciously kicked out with his free boot. The heavy rubber sole connected with a sickening, wet thud against whatever was holding onto his leg. A terrible, high-pitched shrieking sound vibrated through the floorboards, causing the freezing grip to loosen for just a fraction of a second. He yanked his bloodied leg free with a violent jerk, tumbling forward into the muddy, freezing brush below the window. The icy rain hit his face like a handful of small stones, but the sharp pain only confirmed he was still alive. He scrambled to his feet in the dark, ignoring the agonizing, burning sensation radiating from his deeply sliced stomach. Declan sprinted blindly into the thick tree line, completely abandoning his car and everything he owned inside that rotting house. The dense branches whipped violently against his face and arms as he forced his way through the suffocating wilderness. He had absolutely no idea which direction the highway was, but moving away from that room was the only thing that mattered. Every time he glanced back over his shoulder, the total darkness of the forest seemed to be shifting and crawling right behind him. The terrible, wet, slapping sound echoed clearly through the storm, proving that the horrific mass was still actively hunting him. His burning lungs finally gave out when he tripped over a massive, moss-covered log and crashed face first into the freezing mud. He crawled desperately into the hollow space beneath the fallen tree, curling his shivering body into the smallest ball possible. Declan clamped both hands tightly over his mouth to muffle the loud, ragged gasps escaping his throat. The heavy downpour helped mask the noise of his breathing, but he knew that thing did not rely on normal hearing. The wet, dragging footsteps slowly approached his hiding spot, pausing deliberately just a few feet away from the rotting log. He squeezed his eyes completely shut in the pitch black, waiting in absolute, paralyzing terror for those wet roots to find him again. The agonizing sound of dragging meat and wet earth circled the fallen tree for what felt like hours. Declan kept his eyes squeezed tightly shut, terrified that even a single blink would give away his position in the terrifying darkness. Something incredibly heavy pressed down on the rotting bark right above his head, causing the ancient wood to splinter and groan under the immense weight. Thick drops of foul, metallic-smelling slime dripped down through the growing cracks, landing directly onto his shivering cheek. He did not dare to wipe it away, absolutely refusing to move a single muscle while that thing was actively hunting him in the brush. Eventually, the horrific dragging noises slowly began to fade away, blending back into the relentless howling of the bitter winter storm. He stayed completely curled inside that suffocating hollow log until the freezing rain finally slowed to a light, miserable drizzle. The pitch-black woods very slowly shifted into a pale, bruised shade of morning gray, revealing the endless, suffocating sea of dead pine trees. Declan dragged his battered body out of the cramped hiding spot, his legs barely able to support his own weight anymore. His stomach was still bleeding sluggishly from the broken window glass, the warm blood mixing with the freezing mud caked all over his torn clothes. He stumbled blindly through the dense brush, completely numb to the agonizing cold biting relentlessly at his exposed hands and face. There was no conscious thought left in his exhausted mind, only the primal, overriding urge to find a paved road and escape. By the time he finally heard the distant, mechanical rumble of a diesel engine, he had entirely lost all feeling in his toes. He pushed violently through the final tree line and collapsed onto the slick, wet asphalt of a completely empty logging highway. A massive timber truck was barreling down the foggy road, its heavy tires kicking up towering clouds of dirty rainwater. Declan waved his bloodied arms frantically in the air, praying to anyone who would listen that the driver would actually see him through the thick morning mist. The incredibly loud blast of the air horn sent a terrifying jolt through his chest as the massive vehicle violently slammed its brakes. The truck finally skidded to a halt just a few yards away, and a heavy metal door swung open to let him inside the heated cab. The grizzled, heavily bearded trucker did not ask a single question when Declan dragged his ruined, bleeding body up into the elevated passenger seat. He simply took one look at the wild, hollow terror burning in the younger man's eyes and immediately slammed the loud transmission back into gear. The massive diesel engine roared back to life, pulling them away from that cursed stretch of woods as fast as the heavy load allowed. Declan stared blankly out the passenger window, watching the endless wall of dark trees blur past in a silent, terrifying line. The incredible dry warmth of the cabin heater felt like tiny needles stabbing into his freezing skin, but he did not dare complain about the pain. He wrapped both arms tightly around himself, trying desperately to stop the violent shaking that had taken over his entire physical body. Declan ended up in a small, underfunded rural hospital 3 towns over, treated for severe frostbite and deep lacerations to his abdomen. He lied to the local police officers, claiming that he had simply gotten lost while hiking in the dark, completely refusing to mention the boarding house. He knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that they would either think he was completely crazy or that they were already complicit in whatever happens out there. His rusted sedan was never recovered from that hidden driveway, and he never made any attempt to contact his insurance company or retrieve his belongings. The messy, complicated life he was trying to run from back in Toronto suddenly felt incredibly safe and wonderfully unremarkable compared to those endless northern woods. He moved directly into a tiny, brightly lit apartment in the absolute center of a noisy city, avoiding quiet rural places for the rest of his life. You would naturally think that surviving something so completely incomprehensible would make a person deeply appreciate the safety of a securely locked door. For Declan, every single closed door in his apartment became a terrifying daily reminder of that decaying room off the lonely logging road. He completely removed the deadbolt from his bedroom door, absolutely refusing to ever feel trapped in the dark again. Sometimes, when the city noise dies down late at night, He swears he can clearly smell the foul stench of rusted iron and stagnant water creeping into his room. He sits wide awake in his bed, staring intensely at the empty space beneath his doorknob, where a large, old-fashioned keyhole should be. He knows perfectly well that the thing is still out there waiting patiently in the woods, hunting for the next exhausted traveler who needs a place to rest.